This is the LibriVox Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Felicity Campbell. The Ecclesiastical History of England by the Venerable Bede, translated by A. M. Seller, Book 5, Chapters 8 through 12. Chapter 8, 690 A.D. At this time a memorable miracle, and like to those of former days, was wrought in Britain. For, to the end that the living might be roused from the death of the soul, a certain man, who had been some time dead, rose again to the life of the body, and related many memorable things that he had seen, some of which I had thought fit here briefly to describe. There was a certain householder in that district of the Northumbrians, which is called Cuningham, who led a godly life with all his house. This man fell sick, and his sickness daily increasing, he was brought to extremity and died in the beginning of the night. But at dawn he came to life again, and suddenly sat up, whereat all those that sat about the body weeping fled away in great terror. Only his wife, who loved him better, though trembling and greatly afraid, remained with him. And he, comforting her, said, "Fear not, for I am now in very deed risen from dead, whereof I was holden, and permitted again to live among men. Nevertheless, hereafter I must not live as I was wont, but after a very different manner." Then rising immediately, he went to the oratory of the little town, and continuing in prayer till day, forthwith divided all his substance into 3 parts, one whereof he gave to his wife, another to his children, and the third, which he kept himself, he straightway distributed among the poor. Not long after, being set free from the cares of this world, he came to the monastery of Melrose, which is almost enclosed by the winding of the river Tweed, and having received the tonsure, went apart into a place of abode which the abbot had provided, and there he continued till the day of his death, in so great contrition of mind and mortifying of the body, that even if his tongue had been silent, his life would have declared that he had seen many things either to be dreaded or coveted, which were hidden from other men. Thus he related what he had seen. He that led me had a countenance full of light and shining raiment, and we went in silence, as it seemed to me, towards the rising of the summer sun. And as we walked, we came to a broad and deep valley of infinite length. It lay on our left, and one side of it was exceeding terrible with raging flames, the other no less intolerable, for violent hail and cold snows drifting and sweeping through all the place. Both sides were full of the souls of men, which seemed to be tossed from one side to the other, as it were by a violent storm. For when they could no longer endure the fervent heat, the hapless souls leaped into the midst of the deadly cold, and finding no rest there, they leaped back again to be burnt in the midst of the unquenchable flames. Now, whereas an innumerable multitude of misshapen spirits were thus tormented far and near with this interchange of misery, as far as I could see, without any interval of rest, I began to think that peradventure this might be hell, of whose intolerable torments I had often heard men talk. My guide, who went before me, answered to my thoughts, saying, "Think not so, for this is not the hell you believe it to be." When he had led me farther by degrees, sore dismayed by that dread sight, on a sudden I saw the place before us begin to grow dark and filled with shadows. When we entered into them, the shadows by degrees grew so thick that I could see nothing else, save only the darkness and the shape and garment of him that led me. As we went on through the shades in the low night, lo, on a sudden there appeared before us masses of foul flame, constantly rising as it were out of a great pit, and falling back again into the same. When I had been led thither, my guide suddenly vanished, and left me alone in the midst of darkness and these fearful sights. as those same masses of fire without intermission at one time flew up, and at another fell back into the bottom of the abyss, I perceived that the summits of all the flames, as they ascended, were full of the spirits of men, which, like sparks flying upwards with the smoke, were sometimes thrown on high, and again, when the vapours of the fire fell, dropped down into the depths below. Moreover, a stench, foul beyond compare, burst forth with the vapours, and filled all those dark places. Having stood there a long time in much dread, not knowing what to do, which way to turn, or what end awaited me, on a sudden I heard behind me the sound of a mighty and miserable lamentation, and at the same time noisy laughter, as of a rude multitude insulting captured enemies. When that noise, growing plainer, came up to me, I beheld a crowd of evil spirits dragging 5 souls of men wailing and shrieking into the midst of the darkness, whilst they themselves exulted and laughed. Among those human souls, as I could discern, there was one shorn like a clerk, one a layman, and one a woman. The evil spirits that dragged them went down into the midst of the burning pit, and it came to pass that as they went down deeper, I could no longer distinguish between the lamentation of the men and the laughing of the devils, yet I still had a confused sound in my ears. In the meantime, some of the dark spirits ascended from that flaming abyss, and running forward, beset me on all sides, and with their flaming eyes and the noisome fire which they breathed forth from their mouths and nostrils, tried to choke me, and threatened to lay hold on me with fiery tongs which they had in their hands, yet they durst in no wise touch me, though they essayed to terrify me. Being thus on all sides encompassed with enemies and shades of darkness, and casting my eyes hither and thither if haply anywhere help might be found whereby I might be saved, there appeared behind me, on the way by which I had come, as it were, the brightness of a star shining amidst the darkness, which, waxing greater by degrees, came rapidly towards me, and when it drew near, all those evil spirits that sought to carry me away with their tongs dispersed and fled. Now he whose approach put them to flight was the same that led me before, who then turning towards the right began to lead me as it were towards the rising of the winter sun, and having soon brought me out of the darkness, led me forth into an atmosphere of clear light. While he thus led me in open light, I saw a vast wall before us, the length on either side and the height whereof seemed to be altogether boundless. I began to wonder why we went up to the wall, seeing no door in it, nor window, nor any way of ascent. But when we came to the wall, we were presently, I know not by what means, on the top of it, and lo, there was a wide and pleasant plain full of such fragrance of blooming flowers, that the marvellous sweetness of the scents immediately dispelled the foul stench of the dark furnace which had filled my nostrils. So great was the light shed over all this place, that it seemed to exceed the brightness of the day or the rays of the noontide sun. In this field were innumerable companies of men clothed in white, and many seats of rejoicing multitudes. As he led me through the midst of bands of happy inhabitants, I began to think that this perchance might be the kingdom of heaven, of which I had often heard tell. He answered to my thoughts, saying, "Nay, this is not the kingdom of heaven, as you think." When we had also passed those mansions of blessed spirits and gone farther on, I saw before me a much more beautiful light than before, and therein heard sweet sounds of singing, and so wonderful a fragrance was shed abroad from the place, that the other which I had perceived before and thought so great, then seemed to me but a small thing, even as that wondrous brightness of the flowery field, compared with this which I now beheld, appeared mean and feeble. When I began to hope that we should enter that delightful place, my guide on a sudden stood still, and straightway turning, led me back by the way we came. In our return, when we came to those joyous mansions of the white-robed spirits, he said to me, Do you know what all these things are which you have seen? I answered, No. And then he said, That valley which you beheld terrible with flaming fire and freezing cold is the place in which the souls of those are tried and punished who, delaying to confess and amend their crimes, at length have recourse to repentance at the point of death, and so go forth from the body, but nevertheless, because they even at their death confessed and repented, they shall all be received into the kingdom of heaven at the day of judgment. But many are succoured before the day of judgment by the prayers of the living and their alms and fasting, and more especially by the celebration of masses. Moreover, that foul flaming pit which you saw is the mouth of hell, into which whosoever falls shall never be delivered to all eternity. This flowery place in which you see this fair and youthful company, all bright and joyous, is that into which the souls of those are received who indeed, when they leave the body, have done good works, but who are not so perfect as do deserve to be immediately admitted into the kingdom of heaven. Yet they shall all at the day of judgment behold Christ, and enter into the joys of his kingdom. For such as are perfect in every word and deed and thought, as soon as they quit the body, forthwith enter into the kingdom of heaven, in the neighbourhood whereof that place is, where you heard the sound of sweet singing amidst the savour of a sweet fragrance and brightness of light. As for you, who must now return to the body and again live among men, if you will seek diligently to examine your actions, and preserve your manner of living and your words in righteousness and simplicity, you shall, after death, have a place of abode among these joyful troops of blessed souls which you behold. For when I left you for a while, it was for this purpose, that I might learn what should become of you. When he had said this to me, I much abhorred returning to the body, being delighted with the sweetness and beauty of the place which I beheld, and with the company of those I saw in it. Nevertheless, I durst not ask my guide anything, but thereupon, on a sudden, I found myself, I know not how, alive among men. Now these and other things which this man of God had seen, he would not relate to slothful men, and such as lived negligently, but only to those who, being terrified with the dread of torments, or ravished with the hope of everlasting joys, would draw from his words the means to advance in piety. In the neighbourhood of his cell lived one Heimgils, a monk, and eminent in the priesthood, whose good works were worthy of his office. He is still living, and leading a solitary life in Ireland, supporting his declining age with coarse bread and cold water. He often went to that man, and by repeated questioning heard of him what manner of things he had seen when out of the body, by whose account those few particulars which we have briefly set down came also to our knowledge. And he related his visions to King Aldfrid, a man most learned in all respects, and was by him so willingly and attentively heard, that at his request he was admitted into the monastery above mentioned, and received the crown of the monastic tonsure, and the said king, whensoever he came into those parts, very often went to hear him. At that time the abbot and priest Ethelwald, a man of godly and sober life, presided over that monastery. He now occupies the episcopal see of the church of Lindisfarne, leading a life worthy of his degree. He had a place of abode assigned him apart in that monastery, where he might give himself more freely to the service of his Creator in continual prayer, and inasmuch as that place was on the banks of the river, he was wont often to go into the same for the great desire he had to do penance in his body, and oftentimes to plunge in it, and to continue saying psalms or prayers in the same as long as he could endure it, standing still while the waves flowed over him, sometimes up to the middle, and sometimes even to the neck in water. And when he went ashore, he never took off his cold wet garments till they grew warm and dry on his body. and when in the winter the cracking pieces of ice were floating about him, which he had himself sometimes broken to make room to stand or plunge in the river, and those who beheld it would say, "We marvel, brother Drythelm," for so he was called, "that you are able to endure such severe cold," he answered simply, for he was a simple and sober-spirited man, "I have seen greater cold." And when they said, "We marvel that you choose to observe so hard a rule of continence," he replied, "I have seen harder things." And so, until the day of his calling hence, in his unwearied desire of heavenly bliss, he subdued his aged body with daily fasting, and forwarded the salvation of many by his words and life. End of section 25. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.